David Crockett, Scout, by Charles Fletcher Allen. Following Indians. Scouting in the Cherokee Country. The Red Sticks on the move. A scared darky comes into camp on the run. Davy makes a 60-mile ride. Colonel Coffee shows scant appreciation of Davy's efforts. Old Hickory in command of a hungry army. Burning Black Warriors Town. The Canebrake and the Hogs. More news of the Red Sticks. The Battle of Tallushatchee. 185 Indians slain. A squaw kills Lieutenant Moore with an arrow. Evidently, in those days, there was no superstition about the number 13, for the party with which Davy set out the next morning was of 13 men, including Major Gibson. The first day, they reached and crossed the Tennessee at Ditto's Landing and camped 7 miles south, guided by an Indian trader. The next day, the major took 7 of the men, giving Davy charge of those remaining, with orders to meet him at night 15 miles beyond the house of a Cherokee named Brown. On the way, Davy induced a half-breed, Jack Thompson, to follow the party and come to the place where the major was to meet them. They traveled through a rather barren country, sometimes across prairie-like land where wildflowers were abundant and beautiful. In the low places were canebrakes, often 15 to 20 feet high. The scouts avoided the open spaces, fearing both Indians and snakes, which sometimes crippled or killed a horse. Night came on without the major appearing, and Crockett's squad camped among the trees, away from the Indian trail. The hoot of an owl came floating through the silence of the evening, and was at once answered by Davy. It was the signal of the half-breed, who soon afterward came into the gleam of their fire. The morning broke, and there was still no news of the other party of scouts. As usual, Davy decided to go ahead, and pass through a Cherokee village 20 miles further south, reaching the house of a squaw man named Radcliffe in time for dinner. This man they found badly scared. He told them that 10 painted cheeks had left the place during the forenoon. If they learned that he had fed the scouts, they would kill his whole family and burn the house. When dinner was over, Davy found that a few of his men wanted to turn back. They said that the party was too small to venture into the creek country just before them. But Davy knew that some of the men would stand by him, and he determined to go ahead. When he started on, the whole party went along, for the few who wished to go back were afraid to do so alone. Soon after dark, they reached a camp of some friendly Creeks. It was a strange condition of affairs when some of the Indians of this tribe could be trusted, while others were slinking through the woods, smeared from head to foot with vermilion and fierce for blood. The moon was at its full, and for a while Davy and his men tried their skill with the bows and arrows of the Indian boys. While they were doing this, a scared Negro who would join them during the day warned them that the Red Sticks were likely to surprise them, but they made light of his fears. They tied their horses ready to mount at a second's notice and lay with their guns by their sides. They had scarcely dozed when a cry like that of an angry panther rang through the night. The Negro shouted that the Red Sticks were coming, and everyone stood at bay. Then an Indian appeared in the bright moonlight, with the news that the war party had been crossing the Coosa all day at the 10 Islands, on their way to fight Jackson's army, then gathering at Fayetteville in Tennessee. In a few minutes, every Indian in the camp had fled, while Davy and his men put out in a long lope on the back trail to give notice to the force they had left at the landing, 65 miles away. At the Cherokee town they found great fires blazing, but no Indians. Radcliffe and his family had disappeared. At daylight they came to Brown's house, where they ate hurriedly and then pushed on. Having crossed the Tennessee, they reached the volunteers' camp and reported to Colonel Coffee. To Davy's disgust, the colonel seemed to place little confidence in the story he had to tell, so far as the imminence of danger was involved. The little band of scouts had ridden their tired horses 65 miles in 11 hours by moonlight and had forded the river, and they were disgusted by their reception. Davy said that he was burning inside like a tar kiln and wondered that the smoke was not pouring out of him as he withdrew. The next day, the major came into camp with a similar report, which set Colonel Coffee into what Davy called a fidget. He at once threw up breastworks 1,200 feet long and dispatched a messenger to hurry up Jackson's army. It always rankled in Davy's memory that the word of a common soldier and scout could be so lightly held, while the major's report was never doubted for a moment. Davy had much to learn in a world where so many unjustly receive pay and praise for work that is done by obscure toilers. The 40,000 French who lay dead or dying that week before the walls of Leipzig are nameless now, but Napoleon is not forgotten. Davy's sense of the unfairness of fame may be the reason for his later enmity towards Andrew Jackson. When, years afterward, he told of the forced march that brought Old Hickory and his troops to the support of Coffee, he called the general Old Hickory Face. Still suffering and weak from his wound, Jackson arrived at Huntsville with his command the next day, October 11, 1813. The men were wearied with the forced march, and their feet were blistered and lame, so they went to their tents while the volunteers kept watch for the enemy. Although now in charge of at least 2,000 men, Jackson was without supplies, and at this time Major Reed of his staff wrote to a friend. At this place, Thompson's Creek on the Tennessee, we remain a day to establish a depot for provisions. But where these provisions are to come from, God Almighty only knows. I speak seriously when I declare that we may soon have to eat our horses, which may be the best use we can put a great many of them to. Of Davy's movements between October 11th and the following month, we have no account, but he could have played only a minor part in the waiting game that took place. But one day in November, Coffee, with 800 volunteers, including Davy's company, went west to Muscle Shoals, where they crossed the Tennessee, losing some of their horses in the dangerous and rocky fording. From there, the expedition struck south, crossing the Warrior River to Black Warrior's Town, near the present site of Tuscaloosa. Here they found some corn and a lot of dried beans, but no Indians. They burned the town and turned back to meet the main army at the place where Davy and his scouts had waited in vain for Major Gibson in October. The next day the supply of meat gave out, and Davy went to Coffee and asked permission to hunt while the march progressed. He says Coffee told him he might do so, but to take good care of himself. Within an hour he found a freshly killed deer, skinned and still warm. He knew that an Indian must have fled at his approach, and, even under the conditions, had scruples against taking the meat. What he tells of this is so typical of his character that it should be repeated. Though I was never much in favor of one hunter stealing from another, yet meat was so scarce in camp that I thought I must go in for it. So I just took up the deer on my horse before me and carried it on till night. I could have sold it for almost any price I would have asked, but this wasn't my rule, neither in peace nor war. Whenever I had anything and saw a fellow being suffering, I was more anxious to relieve him than to benefit myself. And this is one of the secrets of my being a poor man to this day. But it is my way. And while it has often left me with an empty purse, which is as near the devil as anything else I have ever seen, yet it has never left my heart empty of consolations which money couldn't buy, of having sometimes fed the hungry and covered the naked. Davy kept enough of the deer for his own mess and gave the rest away. Most of the men were living on parched corn. The day after, they made camp near a large cane brake. In these brakes, the cane, of which the scientific name is Arundinaria macrosperma, is an arborescent grass, dying down in the winter but growing to a height of 20 feet in some places during the summer. Into this brake, impassable except for paths made by cattle and swine, Davy went with his rifle after meat. In a short time he found a number of hogs, and as he shot one of them, the whole drove started towards camp. The roar of guns and the squealing of the hogs sounded like an Indian massacre. Most of the hogs and a fat cow were the results of his activity, and for these an order on Uncle Sam was given the people of the Cherokee town where they stopped the next day. Before night they met Jackson's army and turned south with them. At Radcliffe's place they found his two big half-breed sons, and, having learned that he had sent the runner who had so alarmed the camp with the news of the Red Sticks' approach, they forced them to serve as soldiers, to repay Radcliffe for what was intentionally a false alarm. At a place called Camp Wills, coffee was made a general, and other promotions were announced. The next point reached was 10 Islands on the Coosa River, and here they heard of a gathering of Red Sticks at a town 10 miles distant. Jackson sent 900 men under General Coffee to attack them. Part of the force was made up of friendly Cherokees under their chief known as Dick Brown. To prevent being mistaken for the enemy, these Indians wore white feathers and deer tails on their heads. At daybreak, Colonel Alcorn, with the cavalry, in which Davy served, went to the right of the line of march, while Coffee and Colonel Cannon kept to the left, soon enclosing the town completely with a cordon of horse and foot. The Indians discovered their approach and manifested their defiance with yells and frantic beating of their drums. As they refused to come out, Captain Hammond and 2 companies of Rangers advanced to bring on the action. The Indians seemed to have believed this small force to be all with whom they had to deal, for, as Davy says, they soon came at them like so many red devils. As the Rangers fell back, the main army line was reached, and the fight was on. The Creeks fired a volley and ran back to their huts. Slowly the cordon of soldiers closed upon them, and one of the most desperate Indian fights of history took place. The Red Sticks asked no quarter, firing from the shelter of their cabins until they were shot dead by the soldiers who came to their doors, or charging with shrill war cries between the impassable walls of gleaming rifles that surrounded them. Refusing quarter even from the Cherokees, whom they had known as friends before, they fought till they could no longer lift their guns or draw their knives in a last effort. According to Crockett's story of the affair, the squaws rushed through the hail of bullets to ask for mercy. Many of them were accidentally shot in the houses with the men, but that was unavoidable. Every brave was killed, and 84 women and children were taken prisoners. General Coffee counted 186 dead Indians, while of his own force but 5 were killed and 40 wounded. The difference in the mortality between the two sides is remarkable. The red man never knew how hopeless a battle he fought with the juggernaut of civilization. All his savage energy could avail against the pioneer no more than the throne of Hardicanute on Britain's shore could turn the wild and angry waves of the North Sea. During the fight, many of the Creeks took refuge in one of the houses of the town. As the soldiers closed in, a squaw who sat in the doorway with a bow and arrow put her feet against the bow, placed an arrow, pulled with all her might, and killed Lieutenant Moore outright. The act so enraged the soldiers that she was riddled with bullets, and the house, with the 46 Indians in it, was burned. A boy of 12, who had been wounded, was seen by Davy so near the burning house that he was being scorched by the heat. Yet this brave lad made no sound, nor did he ask for help. Though they had gained a decisive victory, The soldiers were in terrible straits for food, and when everything in sight had been eaten, they learned that hunger is sharper than the sword. End of chapter 6.
Hard fighting. The friendly Indians besieged at Talladega. Jackson sends them help. The attempted ambush. Painted scarlet and naked as when they were born. The Battle of Talladega and the Bleaching Skulls. Mutiny of the Volunteers. Davy goes home when his time is up and re-enlists. The Indian victory at Enochapco Creek. Davy is in a furious fight. 100 volunteers killed or wounded. English intrigue at Pensacola. Davy's visit to that place. Many stirring adventures in the Escambia River country. Davy is hungry enough to climb a tree after a squirrel. With powder and lead, he buys corn from an Indian. Home at last. Early in November 1813, Jackson built a fort at 10 Islands on the north shore of the Coosa River, and many refugees came within its stockades. It was called Fort Strother, after the owner of the place on which it stood. On the 7th of the month, an Indian runner arrived with bad news from the friendly town of Talladega, where a small fort had been built. 150 peaceable Creeks were besieged by more than 1,000 Red Sticks and their allies. The latter had given the fort 3 days to surrender, and relied on thirst and hunger to bring their intended victims to terms. The runner, who came to Jackson, is said to have disguised himself as a hog in order to escape in the woods nearby. Jackson resolved to save the friendly Indians at any risk. Their faithfulness could not be unrewarded. They had refused all attempts to turn their allegiance, and when the enemy tried to induce them to help whip Jackson's army and secure the booty that might be expected, they were repulsed with scorn. Just after midnight, Jackson began crossing the river with 2,000 men, of whom 800 were mounted. He relied upon the arrival of General White with his men to protect Fort Strother. It was sunup of the 8th when the little army came in sight of Talladega and deployed to right and left for the purpose of surrounding the hostile Creeks. Only through the bravery of the beleaguered Indians were the companies under Major Russell and Captain Evans saved from an ambush. As they drew near to the fort, the friendly Indians within shouted in welcome, "How do, brother, how do?" This they kept up till Major Russell had passed the fort and was headed for the brush-covered creek behind it, where the enemy waited to surprise him. The friendly Creeks tried in vain to call him to a halt, and at least 2 of them leaped from the walls, ran to his horse's head, and pointed out the danger. At once the hidden warriors fired on them, and, to quote Crockett's description of the event, they came forth like a cloud of Egyptian locusts, screaming as if all the young devils had been turned loose, with the old devil of all at their head. The rays fell before the survivors broke through the line of drafted militia and escaped. When Davy returned that way, a year afterward, he saw the bleaching skulls scattered about like gourds upon a winter field. At Fort Strother, after returning from Talladega, the volunteers, whose 60 days were long elapsed, asked to go home for fresh horses and clothing, but Jackson, who felt that he needed every man, refused permission. White had failed him, following orders from General Koch, and the situation was a bad one. Volunteers were within their rights, but the general was determined, and as they prepared to leave, he covered with cannon and the guns of his other troops a bridge that must be crossed on leaving camp. Of this affair, a dramatic account is given in Eggleston's History of the War. He tells us that behind the cannoneers with matches lit, their general gave the malcontents a few seconds in which to go back, with the promise of shot and shell if they refused. And then, the story runs, the mutineers gave in and asked for terms. Davy Crockett says that the discontented volunteers, with flints picked and guns primed, marched across the bridge, amid the clicking of the gun locks of the militia, some of whom had run at the Battle of Talladega. He says they were determined to fight their way or die together. The merits of this affair are in dispute, but Davy and his company returned to Tennessee, where many re-enlisted after a time. It may be set down for certain that from that day Davy was no friend of Jackson. When Davy returned to the Creek country, he went to serve the balance of 6 months, although his term of 2 months had expired. Jackson now had less than 1,000 whites, with about 250 Cherokees and friendly Creeks. One of the companies was made up of officers whose men had gone home. Major Russell was in command of the body of scouts, of whom Davy was one. It is strange that such a small force could not be supplied with provisions. It seems to have been in no way backed up by the government. But in the East, matters had not gone well. Perry's victory and other naval successes had not made the New Englanders any more loyal. Their pockets had suffered, and the prizes won in privateering were only a partial salve for their losses. The war with the Alabama nations was not regarded as a matter of importance on the Atlantic coast. It was from the ranks of the ill-fed volunteers of Kentucky and Tennessee that victory was to come. The Battle of New Orleans was fought after the conclusion of peace, but the capture of that city by Pakenham would have meant more war. Jackson knew the danger of Indian victories, and with his hungry and ragged troops and scouts fought regardless of odds. Davy Crockett was one of the men who learned to know what hunger was, but he was eager to be in the hottest of the trouble, and never had enough. In January 1814, Jackson's little army pushed on to the horseshoe bend of the Tallapoosa River and camped in a hollow square, with every prospect of being attacked by hostiles who were in great numbers in the vicinity. 2 hours before dawn, the pickets were heard firing. Throwing brush on the campfires, the volunteers waited for the attack, expecting to see the Indians by the glare of the flames. But the Creeks kept out of sight, and were themselves aided in aiming by the light in the camp. 4 whites were killed and a number wounded, and although several charges were made, Jackson found it necessary to retreat. The dead were burned to prevent their being scalped, and the force fell back to the Enochicopco Creek. Some historians have called this affair a victory. When the army was about to cross the creek, the savages fell on the rear guard, which Colonel Carroll was commanding. On the right flank, Colonel Perkins was in charge, and on the left, Colonel Stump. Carroll did his duty bravely, but the other colonels fled, and their men followed. As Stump rode fanatically past Jackson, the general tried to cut down the coward with his sword, but missed him. Colonel Carroll was thus left with only 25 men and was in danger of being cut to pieces by the yelling and triumphant warriors. Then the scouts under Russell, with the aid of the artillerymen, who had only 1 6-pound cannon, sprang to the aid of the rear guard, and Davy had a chance to fight that must have satisfied him. While the artillerymen were dragging the piece up the bank of the creek and loading it with grape, Davy's company, led by old Major Russell, rushed across the stream and attacked the left flank of the Indians, who outnumbered the whites 10-1. Constantine Perkins and Craven Jackson of the Cannoneers at last swept the ranks of the savages, huddled in the narrow descent to the creek, with a hail of grape. Then the scouts fell on the demoralized enemy, who took to the woods, and Jackson's army was saved. 189 dead Indians were counted after this fight, and 20 volunteers were killed and 75 wounded. It is worthwhile to consider the iron tenacity of Old Hickory in the face of such disastrous losses. Practically without an army and with no supplies for the friendly Creeks, he renewed his appeals to the people of Tennessee and Kentucky and hopefully awaited their response. Every day of delay made the danger greater, for the Creeks were constantly securing firearms and powder and lead from the British agents at Pensacola. The spectacle of the English unloading guns and scalping knives for the savages at a Spanish port has always been miserable to look upon. But in 1865, after the surrender of Lee had ended the Civil War, 25 cases of Colt's Navy revolvers, received by way of London, were taken from the warehouse of the Confederate agent at St. George's in the Bermuda Islands, sold to an American, and sent to New York on the bark Palo Alto. The Southern Army had Hartford revolvers, by way of England and the blockade, with which to fight the brothers of the men who made them. Until the United States government prohibited the shipping of beef to Nassau, Bermuda, and Havana, there was a supply sent to the Confederates through the blockade, as best it could be by New York dealers. There is no use in the pot calling the kettle black. As the volunteers returned to their homes, they stirred the hearts of their neighbors with the story of Jackson's bravery and self-sacrifice, and the indifference of the people turned to enthusiasm. Before the end of February, Coffee returned to Alabama with 200 of his old brigade, and there soon followed him 2,000 men from western Tennessee, and 2,000 more from the mountains of eastern Tennessee. Every man was a rifleman. The Choctaws also offered the stubborn general all the warriors of their tribe to fight the Creeks. After serving about 4 months instead of the 2 for which he had first volunteered, Davy Crockett returned to his home, and for some time he was busy in providing for the comfort of his family. After the Battle of Tohopeka in March 1814, in which Jackson completely routed the hostile Creeks, the victorious general made plans for an attack on Pensacola, which port the British fleet was using as if it were under the gridiron flag. Davy has said of this time, "I determined to go again with them to Pensacola, as I wanted a small taste of British fighting, and I supposed they would be there." It was in vain that Polly Crockett begged him to change his mind. Under the command of Major Russell, he crossed the Tennessee at Muscle Shoals, and at the junction of the Alabama and the Tombigbee rivers, was 2 days behind the main army of General Jackson. Here they found the horses of the army, and left their own, as forage was not to be had nearer to Pensacola. With their guns, blankets, and provisions, they made the march of nearly 80 miles in 2 days, and came in sight of the town and the British fleet, which lay off the port. It was now November of the year 1814, and as Jackson had made terms with the Indians, and had occupied Pensacola, he marched his army to New Orleans, where the British were defeated in the following January. As Crockett was now at liberty to go home, he did so, but he was a long time getting there. A careless reading of his story of this period of his adventurous life is utterly confusing, but with a better understanding of his meaning, the account is a logical one. Davy called things as he was accustomed to hear them called, and when he speaks of the Scamby River, he, meaning the Escambia, or calls the Conecuh, the Conacher, he gives the best proof that in his relation he is not indebted to the imagination of an educated and inventive editor. In Eggleston's intensely interesting history of the Creek War, the author tells us that after his treaty with the Creek Nation, August 14, 1814, General Jackson went back to the Hermitage because his work was done, and that for a year Red Eagle, the vanquished chief, was his guest. But for Hickory Grove, the place of the treaty, Jackson must have gone to Pensacola, which he occupied November 7, 1814, and as he fought the Battle of New Orleans on January 1815. It is a cause for wonder that many historians should make a statement so far from facts known to the ordinary schoolboy. It was in November that Davy and his regiment set out for Tennessee. Just how long the trip lasted, we do not know. But before it ended, they met volunteers from the Tennessee mountains bound to New Orleans. Among them was a younger brother of Davy's, as well as many of his old neighbors. The regiment to which Davy belonged seems to have gone to Fort Montgomery, near Fort Mims, and then towards Pensacola, and back and forth between the Choctawhatchee and the Escambia rivers, intent, for the most part, on getting something to eat. Some of their adventures are of interest, but must be referred to without any attempt to fix their dates. Davy tells them as they happened to come into his head, and his book was written 20 years after. On reaching the Escambia, they found a flooded country, and waded 1.5 miles in cold water up to their shoulders. Reaching the highland and yellow pine timber, they were drying themselves when their spies came leaping the brush like so many old bucks, with the news that they had found a hostile Creek camp. After the braves and Major Russell had been suitably decorated with war paint, they set out for the place. But before they reached it, 2 of their Choctaw scouts treacherously killed 2 Creeks whom they had met. The fight was thus prevented, as a firing alarmed the Creek camp, and the hostiles made good their escape. Davy's party found that the scouts had already cut off the heads of the Creeks, and each warrior in turn walked up to the heads and struck them with a war club. Davy says that after he had done this, the Choctaws danced about him, struck him on the shoulders, and called him warrior, warrior. Soon after this they found a Spaniard and his wife and 4 children killed and scalped, and Davy says the sight made him feel ticklish. After scouting about between the Escambia and the Choctawhatchee, the regiment divided, a part going to Baton Rouge, where they joined Jackson on his way to New Orleans. From now on, Davy was looking out for his stomach, hunting everything alive along the trail: hawks, squirrels, small birds, gophers, and even wood rats were thrown into one pile each night by the hunters and then divided. One evening Davy came in without fur or feather for the pile, but there was a sick man in his mess, and Davy intended to feed him, even if he himself went home. He found Captain Cowan, his commander, broiling a turkey gizzard, and was told that the turkey had been killed by Major Smiley and divided among the sick. Davy went straight to Smiley's campfire, and he, too, was broiling a turkey's gizzard. Davy told the Major that it was the first time he had heard of a turkey with two gizzards, but it ended with the sick man going hungry. The next morning, Davy and his mess went on ahead, desperate with hunger. There appears to have been no attempt to preserve military discipline. For 3 days they went without food and were ready to lie down and die. At last, they came to a wide prairie, crossed it, and found a large creek and wooded bottom boats. Then a squirrel was seen, and Davy shot him, but the stricken animal managed to get into a hole in the tree, 30 feet from the ground. Davy climbed the tree without a limb to help him, and fished the dead creature out of the hole. He says that showed how hungry he was. Shortly after, he and the man with him shot 2 more squirrels, and also started up a flock of wild turkeys, finally killing 2 of them. The hunters then raised a shout, and were soon joined by the rest of their party when they cooked the game and ate it without salt or bread. The next day a relief corps came back with a small quantity of flour and other food from Fort Decatur, and some bee trees were also found, the honey making some of the men sick. Reaching Fort Decatur, the company could get no more than 1 ration of meat and no bread. Davy, who never spared himself, crossed the river and went to Black Warrior's Town, where he tried to buy food. Taking off his large hat, he offered an Indian a silver dollar if he would fill it with corn. The Indian had no corn, but he told Davy of another of the tribe who had some left. When the latter was asked to sell part of his precious store, he refused silver. "You got some bullet?" he asked. Davy produced 10 bullets, for which he got his hat full of corn. The Indian weighed the matter in his mind and asked again, "You got some powder?" For 10 charges of powder, another hatful was bought and tied up in Davy's hunting shirt. He said that 50 silver dollars would not have bought it. After much tramping, going out of the way to get rations, and leaving as many as 13 horses played out in a single day, they reached Fort Strother on the Tennessee. Here it was that the volunteers going to New Orleans were met, among them Davy's younger brother. From there, Davy went directly home to his family. "I found them all well and doing well," he says, "and although I was only a rough-backed woodsman, they seemed mighty glad to see me. However, little the quality folks might suppose it, for I do reckon we love as hard in the backwoods country as many people in the whole creation." End of chapter 7.
Beans Creek. 2 years on Beans Creek. A new girl in the family. The death of Polly Crockett. Some years of peace. The prairie schooner and the steamboat make their appearance. Davy marries again. He makes another excursion into Alabama and nearly dies of fever. Saved by a whole bottle of Bateman's drops. Returns home and moves to Shoal Creek. Becomes a magistrate of Giles County and learns to write. Elected colonel of a regiment of state militia. Davy enters the political field. Squirrel hunts and barbecues. He makes his first stump speech. Elected to the state legislature and becomes the Honorable David Crockett. Of the period of his life described in the preceding chapter, Davy afterwards said, "This closed my career as a warrior, and I am glad of it, for I liked life a heap better now than I did then, and I am glad all over that I lived to see these times, which I should not have done if I had kept fooling along in war and got used up at it." He then goes on to say something of the political situation when he was writing his book, and this, though irrelevant, will be quoted as a good specimen of his style of writing and his determined opposition to the proceedings of the Jackson administration nearly 20 years later. When I say I am glad, I just mean that I am glad that I am alive, for there is a confounded heap of things that I ain't glad of at all. I ain't glad, for example, that the government moved the deposits, here he refers to Jackson's war on the United States Bank, and if my military glory should take such a turn as to make me president after the general's time, I'll move them back. Yes, I, the government, will take the responsibility and move them back again. If I don't, I wish I may be shot. The illustrations on the preceding page show the two sides of a coin struck in the days of the Bank War, and the legends and designs of this curious token are from the partisan phrases of the enemies of Old Hickory. For 2 years, Davy remained at the Beans Creek home, where a girl baby was added to his family. Then came a turning point in his career, the death of Polly Crockett. At the age of about 27, the little wife whom Davy had loved, as he says, almost enough to eat her, passed into the far unknown. She had fulfilled the duties of the true woman, and brought her children into the world, and cared for them, while their father fought back the terror of the scalping knife and tomahawk. The year 1817 came in as the first in which the armies of the world were not to cut each other's throats or do battle to the death. The phantom of Napoleon had arisen to confound the pampered sovereigns of the world, and to lead to bloody graves the youth and strength of Europe. Out of the temporary tyranny of the little corporal had come the Louisiana Purchase, that was to change the history of our own country. 28 years of war was past, and Napoleon was now quarreling with his jailer at St. Helena. At last, the dethroned emperor could remember with satisfaction his words after he had sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States. I have given England a rival who, sooner or later, will humble her pride. His prophecy was coming true. Endless caravans of prairie schooners were wending their way to the west, and on a single turnpike 15,000 wagons paid toll in 1817. In Pittsburgh there were less than 10,000 people, and Chicago was yet unknown. Everywhere in the valleys of the great rivers, and out upon the rolling plains from whence their waters came, the log cabin or the sod house arose as if by magic. A single room, a door with latch and string, and perhaps a window of paper rubbed with oil, were what the settler pictured in his dreams of a future home. The first steamboat upon the Mississippi, at St. Louis, was a harbinger of the new dispensation, the era of steam. The spirit of progress let no man rest, and from each new Indian purchase to the next, the pioneer went on, unsatisfied. Davy Crockett was now 31, a rough backwoodsman, unable to write, but strong and brave. His brother and his wife had come to live with Davy, and to help in caring for his 2 boys and the baby, but he felt the need of a real home. At last he married the widow of a volunteer killed in the Creek War. Between them they had 5 children to begin housekeeping with. Davy's second marriage was a wise step, and he never regretted it. Having thus provided himself with a helpmeet, he was at liberty to indulge the restless strain in his blood by an excursion into Alabama with 3 neighbors. Why he did so is not of record, but he had been farming for nearly 3 years, and evidently wanted to change. Crossing the Tennessee, the 4 men went to where Tuscaloosa is now situated. One of the party, named Frazier, was bitten by a copperhead snake in crossing a swamp, and was left at the house of a settler whom he had known before the war. The others made camp and hobbled their horses for the night. The job was not a good one, or someone maliciously cut the ropes, for in the night the bells of the ponies were heard, showing that they were moving about and uneasy. At daylight, Davy set out to bring them in, carrying his rifle, which he says was a very heavy one. At every place where he found settlers, he heard that the horses had passed along, but no one had tried to stop them. After going nearly 50 miles, across swamps and streams, through canebrakes and over mountains, he gave up the chase and stayed the night at the first house he could find. He started to retrace his steps the next morning, but by noon he was too sick to keep on. His rifle was heavier than ever, his head was aching with a fierce pain, and in the midst of the wilderness he lay down, beside the trace, to see if rest would help him. A little after noon, several Indians found him, and offered him some ripe melons. He could not eat, and when the Indians signed to him that he would die under such conditions, he fully agreed with them. They told him that there was a house only a mile and a half away, and he tried to reach it. He reeled like a cow with the blind staggers, and finally hired one of the Indians to carry his gun for $50. Reaching the house, Davy was dosed with hot drinks and put to bed. The next day, although he had a high fever and was half delirious, he persisted in going on with 2 of his Tennessee neighbors who had come along. They were bound to the place where the horses had escaped, and Davy took turns at riding behind the men until the old camp was reached. His comrades were still there, and as Davy grew worse, they took him to the house of a man named Jesse Jones, and went on with the 2 men who had brought him back. For 2 weeks Davy was very ill, most of the time unconscious. Despairing of his recovery, Mrs. Jones gave him a whole bottle of Bateman's Drops, the only medicine she had in the house. He tells us that the result was a profound sweat which lasted till morning. Then he awoke and asked for water, nearly frightening the kind woman to death, for she had expected him to die without recovering consciousness. The crisis being over, he slowly recovered, and, when able to leave, hired his passage with a wagoner who came along, and who lived 20 miles from Davy's home on Beans Creek. When he hove in sight of his humble dwelling on a borrowed horse, he was welcomed as one from the dead. The men who had first set out with him had returned with the report of his death, and his wife had sent for his money, rifle, and other effects. The men had brought his horse home, having found all the stray ponies together. Another year passed at the same place. Then he concluded that it was too unhealthful there, and decided to go 80 miles north and west into the newly purchased Chickasaw lands. The place where he built his 4th cabin in 1818 was at the head of Shoal Creek, near the divide between the Duck and Elk rivers. He at first started out to explore the country for some distance, but was taken sick and had to remain near the creek until he recovered. Before that time, he concluded to try the place as a cure for the fever and ague contracted in Alabama. Shoal Creek was but a little way from the eastern border of the Chickasaw land purchase. In many respects, it was like the no-man's land of Texas, without defined limits, laws, or courts. Many outlaws moved in and started to run things to suit themselves. To protect their rights and properties, the law-respecting men came together, selected magistrates, and gave it out that punishment would be the lot of those convicted of wrongdoing. It was probably 1820 when this was done, and Davy Crockett was chosen to act as a justice of the peace. He set about his duties without misgiving. In civil actions, he heard the evidence and ordered judgment, or dismissed the action, as the evidence seemed to warrant. The constable who assisted in these matters was able to make out the necessary execution papers, or writs, and nobody questioned their validity. Sometimes the prisoner brought before Davy would be a man who had been marking his neighbor's hogs. Proof of guilt was followed by a whipping, and orders to leave the place. In the far west, this marking is called brand blotting, and the cattle thief or rustler seldom gets into court, or even is buried on the lonely prairie where he meets his fate. When matters had gone along in this way for some time, the legislature of Tennessee made a new county named Giles, containing 600 square miles, and including that part of the purchase where Davy lived. In commissioning justices of the peace, all those who had been acting as such were duly appointed. When he was furnished with books of record and the usual blanks for his proceedings, Davy awoke to the knowledge of his inability to read or write well enough to act. But with the help of his constable, who seems to have signed for him in any emergency, the new squire managed for a while, and in the meanwhile diligently used his time in improving his handwriting, until at last he was able to do his part of the work. If he was a poor scholar, he had a keen sense of right and wrong, and disregarded all the cobwebs with which lawyers delight to obscure the spectacles of the learned judges before whom they plead. Red Eagle, or Weatherford, 3/4 a white man, and one of the craftiest and wisest of the nation he ruled, would never learn to read or write, believing these accomplishments would cloud his perception of affairs about him. He was a great orator, and could make a better speech than Davy Crockett ever learned to make. As Davy had never read a page of a law book before becoming a squire, he relied on common sense in his decisions, and they were never appealed from. The sense of his responsibility and importance in the community in which he lived added to his dignity and self-possession, and he no longer resembled the awkward and boyish scout from Beans Creek. That there was something about him that people admired is plainly shown, for the honors that he bore were almost invariably thrust upon him, not sought after. It is not known with what motive he was asked by Captain Matthews, a well-to-do neighbor, to run for the office of major of a certain regiment, the captain being out for the colonelcy. Davy at first refused, but finally he allowed his name to be used, and with his family attended a barbecue given by the captain at his home. The principal part of the affair was, of course, the serving of the meat of an ox roasted whole, and the generous dispensation of such beverages as the country afforded. But there was also a corn husking on the captain's place, and the young fellows and the shy damsels who expected to pay the usual penalty for finding a red ear of corn were with the older people from far and near. In the midst of the frolic, a friend told Davy that the captain's son had decided to run for major against him. Davy went to the captain and asked what it all meant. It seems likely that the decision of his son must have been a surprise to the captain, but he said the story was true, though the young man dreaded to run against Davy Crockett, preferring almost any other opponent. This was enough to get Davy's dander up. He told the captain to tell his son not to worry, for Davy Crockett was going to run against his father for the office of colonel. The two men went into the midst of the company, and the captain, mounting on a wagon, announced that Crockett was to be his opponent in the election of a colonel. That there was something of the real old Southern gentleman in the makeup of the captain showed in this frank introduction of the man who was to run against him. As soon as the captain had climbed down, Davy mounted the wagon, and explained why he had decided to try for the office of colonel instead of major. He said that as he had the whole family to run against, he thought he might as well levy on the head of the mess. Another man offered for the office of major, and both he and Crockett were elected by good pluralities over the captain and his son. Davy was now becoming a man of weight in the county, and even beyond its borders. Politics then was the same keen game as it is today, a little cruder perhaps, but not more scrupulous. The leaders were looking for men who could get votes, and in Davy they saw great promise. He was asked to run for the legislature, and in February 1821 he agreed to. As the election was not until some months later, he took a drove of horses to North Carolina, and was gone 3 months. As soon as he returned, he began an active campaign, in those days called electioneering. He says that he found that people expected him to tell them about things of which he knew nothing. His ideas of government and constitutions were scarcely nebulous, and it behooved him to listen to the words of wisdom that fell upon his ears. Like many wise men and judges, he knew enough to reserve his opinion, and to follow the example of the tar baby, who kept on saying nothing. The assembly district comprised 2 or 3 counties, and it required much traveling to cover the field. The most trying event in Davy's history was undoubtedly his coming before the Duck River people at the time of the big squirrel hunt and barbecue. From all parts of the district the squirrel hunters came, with the best rifles the world had ever seen. When Davy was chosen by one of the 2 sides, he received the best possible advertisement. The hunt lasted 2 days, and only the scalps were needed in the count, the squirrels being eaten by the hunters. The nuts were yet unripe, but the corn had suffered from the little animals' greed, and they were fat and saucy. Black squirrels, gray squirrels, foxies, red squirrels, all helped to swell the count. Davy killed a large number in the way by which he had made a reputation. He barked them by shooting between the squirrel and the limb on which it sat, generally killing it without a scar. When the scalps were counted, it was found that Davy's side had won, and their opponents furnished the materials for the barbecue and provided music for the dancing that followed. All day great fires had been kept going in long pits dug in the ground, hard, dry beech and maple being used for fuel. On the next morning, the last day of the hunt, half of a fatted ox or deer was placed over the coals of each pit on an iron rod or a green sapling, and slowly roasted, being carefully watched, seasoned, and basted with fat. When everything was ready, the meat was cut from the bones by skillful carvers, and the hungry crowd was served. There is no sauce like hunger, and no meat like that roasted over a bed of hardwood coals. After the feast came the dancing, but between the barbecue and the time for the Virginia reel and monkey musk, with the hoedowns, pigeon wings, and other ritual embellishments, the people had to be amused, and Davy was called on for a speech. What he thought and did in this crisis is best told in his own words. A public document I had never seen, nor did I know there were such things, and how to begin I couldn't tell. I made many apologies and tried to get off, for I knowed I had to run against a man who could speak prime, and I know, too, that I wasn't able to shuffle and cut with him. He was there, and, knowing my ignorance as well as I did myself, he also urged me to make a speech. The truth is, he thought my being a candidate was a mere matter of sport, and didn't think for a moment that he was in any danger from an ignorant backwoods bear hunter. I found I couldn't get off, so I determined just to go ahead and leave it to chance what I should say. I got up and told the people I reckoned they'd know what I had come for, but if not, I could tell them. I had come for their votes, and if they didn't watch mighty close, I'd get them too. Then I tried to speak about something else, about government, until I choked up as bad as if my mouth had been jammed and crammed chock full of dry mush. There the people stood, listening all the while, with their eyes, mouths, and ears open to catch every word I would speak. At last I told them I was like a fellow I had heard of not long before. He was beating on the head of an empty barrel near the roadside, when a traveler, passing along, asked him what he was doing that for. The fellow replied that there had been some cider in that barrel a few days before, and he was trying to see if there was any then. He said if there was, he couldn't get at it. I told them there had been a little bit of speech in me a while before, but I believed I couldn't get it out. Having in this way set the crowd to roaring with laughter, Davy told them a few stories, then took the first chance to say that he was as dry as a powder horn. A great cheer rose as he led the way to the stand where rum, apple and peach brandies, cider, and buttermilk were to be had. Then came the country dances, the name being a popular rendering of the French term contredanse, and the figures the same as might have been seen, before the Revolution, in the gay court of Louis XIV. As Davy, thoroughly at home, took his part in the extravagant features of the frolicsome reels and riotous quadrilles, he made votes by the hundred, and when the day of the election came about, he had 2/3 of all those cast. End of Chapter 8.
Chapter 9. A Cabin in the Wilderness. Davy builds a mill and distillery. Along Shoal Creek. A tidal wave in politics. Another one in Shoal Creek leaves Davy without $1. The year 1822 sees Davy seeking a new home on the Obion River. Encounter of his party with floods. The story of the flatboat's trip up the Obion. Davy builds a cabin in the wilderness. A great day for deer. The passing of the red man. Davy returns to the Obion with his whole family. Risks his life for a keg of powder at Christmas time. He is now loaded for bears. While Davy Crockett was rapidly becoming known to the people of his state, he was planning to increase his income by building a large distillery and a mill for grinding corn, with an addition for the manufacture of powder. He had saved enough money partly to pay for it, and built it in a great measure with his own hands. After the mill began its output, Mrs. Crockett acted as miller when Davy was absent. She is said to have been able to lift the bags of corn about, as well as the men who brought them could. The tourist today will look in vain for the sight of the mill, where the great wheel turns slowly beneath the weight of the waters of the creek, and the rumble of the millstones startled the traveler with the sound of distant thunder. The rhododendron now opens its gorgeous buds, and the laurels cover the waste places with a measureless profusion of delicate flowers. Among the hemlocks, close to the quiet stream, the thrush and the catbird sing their liquid scores, and the redbird and the scarlet tanager vie with the Kentucky and blue-winged yellow warblers in the glory of their April dress. All things are changed in these old places of the world until we climb the mountains to its top and see the far blue ranging crests that blend at last with gentle skies, unchanging and unchanged. When Davy set out for Nashville to take his seat as a member of the legislature, he had finished his mill but still owed for labor and material. The mill was worth $3,000 or $4,000, and besides that he owed several able-bodied slaves and more than the usual stock of goods and chattels. He saw prosperity and honors assured, and his soul was full of faith in the future. The legislature that came together after the elections of 1821 was composed of the class that represented the men of the frontier rather than the aristocracy that had hitherto monopolized both the wealth and the honors of the state. In the same year, William Carroll, who had so bravely commanded the rear guard of Jackson's forces at Anoda-Chapco Creek, was a candidate for the governorship. He represented, as did Davy, the men who paid rentals to monopolists and taxes to the state that favored the wealthy in the filling of remunerative offices. When Carroll's enemies accused him of having let his note go to protest, they threw a boomerang that slew them in its sudden homeward flight, for Carroll's friends made it known that he had lost everything in going security for them in dire financial straits. His opponent, Ward, was cold and unapproachable. To him, a man from the cane brakes or the windowless cabins of the mountains was little better than the savages just beyond. In Phelan's History of Tennessee, there is mention of a sarcastic letter printed in the Nashville Clarion over the signature, "A Big Fish." In this, the supposed big fish, or big bug, as the aristocrat was then often called, gave the reasons why he could not vote for Carroll. He said that Carroll was born of poor parents and had never learned the rudiments of Latin and Greek. As a boy and a young man, he had plowed and reaped and cleared the land. He had always been handy at log rollings, country weddings, and huskings. He had gone to the wars instead of staying home to save the wealth that was needed for the governor's position. He could not support the dignity of the great office with fine dinners, splendid carriages, liveried servants, and state balls. He was too ready to shake hands with the ragged soldier because they had fought on the same fields. A man who was not above such low-born loons was not fit to command the votes of the educated and the men of the higher classes. Carroll received 42,000 votes, while his austere and wealthy rival had but 11,000. On the same popular tidal wave, Davy Crockett was carried to Nashville as a representative of his neighbors in the recent purchase from the Indians, and in the atmosphere that prevailed in the halls of state he believed he had found his place. Davy had hardly been sworn in as a member of the legislature when bad news from home reached him. A freshet had swept away his mill, and his distillery was worthless without the corn that was ground by it. When he had served through the session, he rode home, sold all that he had, and paid every dollar he could realize to his creditors. He was left with nothing but his household plunder, as he termed it, and the times were hard. The loan bank scheme that was to provide a currency and credit for development of the state had become a failure. There was nothing to do in such times but to live by the sweat of the brow. His wife stood bravely by him, and he gave up all he had and took a brand-fire new start. He was now 36, and his oldest boy was 16. With this son and a young man named Abram Henry, Davy started in the spring of 1822 to look at the Obion River region, then reputed to be full of game. It was a long tramp across an unsettled country, nearly 150 miles in a bee-line, and the three led a single horse which carried their scanty outfit of food, blankets, and ammunition. There were many streams to cross, including the Tennessee. In what is now Carroll County, they struck the head of the South Fork of the Obion River, and this they followed to a place about 10 miles south of where the small settlement named after Crockett now is situated. Here they found themselves in a wilderness abounding with game. The three nearest cabins were 7, 15, and 20 miles distant. The one 7 miles away was that of the Owens family, and it was on the other side of the Rutherford Fork of the Obion, a tortuous stream, then in flood and over its low banks for half a mile on either shore. The water was chilly, the depth uncertain, and the crossing difficult and full of danger. There was nothing to do but to take to the water, and after hobbling the horse so that he could graze till they returned for him, they went at it like so many beavers. When the water was too deep to go ahead, Davy felt the way over the shallower bottom by using a pole. His boy often had to swim beside them, and progress was slow. When the river channel was reached, they found that a tree had fallen and lodged in a pile of flood trash near the middle of the main stream. The water was deep at this place, and there was no way of crossing without some kind of bridge. A large buttonwood tree stood up the near side of the river, and the two men began cutting it down with Davy's tomahawk. They managed to do this so that it fell above the flood trash, and when it had been washed against it, the bridge was ready. When we got over this, says Davy, it was still a sea of water as far as the eye could reach. We took into it again and went ahead for about a mile, hardly ever seeing a single spot of land, and sometimes it was very deep. When at last we came in sight of land and got out, it was but a little way before we saw the house, which was more pleasing even than the sight of land. I felt mighty sorry when I would look at my boy and see him shaking like he had the worst kind of an ague, for there was no time for fever then. As we got near the house, we saw Mr. Owens and several men that were with him just starting away. They saw us and stopped, but looked much astonished until we got up to them, and I made myself known. The men who were with him were the owners of a boat, which was the first that had ever went that far up the Obion River, and some hands they had hired to carry it about 100 miles further up by water, though it was only about 30 by land, as the river is very crooked. The whole party then went back to the Owens cabin, where Mrs. Owens won Davy's gratitude by taking charge of the shivering boy. A great fire blazed in the fireplace, and before that they dried themselves. After supper, leaving his boy with Mrs. Owens, Davy and the others went on board of the boat and stayed all night. It was a flat-bottomed boat, drawing but a foot or so of water. The cabin, or deck-house, was of light material, furnished with bunks, and stored with the freight that would be injured by rains. The other freight was lashed on deck, and the load was all that was safe to carry. This boat was carrying flour, sugar, castings, coffee, salt, and other goods needed on the frontier, and was to go as far as Macklemore's Bluff. This was in Carroll County, as now named, and the crew were to be paid $500 bonus if they landed the freight at that point. It was to be a proof that the river was navigable thus far, though it seems a flood was first necessary. In the morning, Davy went with the boat to help get it by a place on the river where a hurricane had blown trees across it, making it hard to get through. They found that the water had gone down and had to wait for a rain. The next day it rained rip-roariously, as Davy tells us, but yet not enough. While waiting, Davy and the boatman crossed the fork and in a short time slapped up a cabin on a spot selected by him. Here Davy procured 4 barrels of meal, 1 of salt, and 10 gallons of spirits, in payment for which he was to help get the boat to Macklemore's Bluff. Henry and the boy were left in the new cabin, after a deer had been killed for them, and other supplies provided. The day after the cabin was built, Davy started out with his rifle for a hunt. Within a few minutes he had killed a fine buck and hung him up. He started to go back to the boat for help in bringing him in, but on the way he struck the trail of a number of elk, and went after them. In a short time he saw 2 deer, large bucks with immense antlers. He dropped one, and then shot the other, which would not leave the first one killed. Hanging the 2 out of reach of bears and wolves, Davy kept after the elk till evening, when he gave up the chase, being 4 miles from the cabin, and as hungry as a wolf. As he set out for the river, on his way back he killed 2 more bucks. Dressing these in the usual way with the skins on, he hung them up and kept on. Before he got to the river, just at sundown, he killed another buck, making 6 since morning. At last he reached the lower edge of the hurricane, and was disappointed at not finding the boat there. He had not expected it could be taken through that day. When he fired his rifle as a signal, the answer came from up the river. He then knew that he had to crawl and climb through the hurricane, in which all kinds of berry bushes and vines were growing. A fat coon would have had a hard time in getting through after him, he tells us. Finally he got to a place where a skiff came for him. He says that he felt as if he needed sewing up all over, thanks to the brambles and briars along his trail, and he was so tired that he could scarcely work his jaws to eat. The next morning 4 of the deer were secured and taken on board, and the voyage proceeded. Pushing and hauling with ropes, it took 11 days to reach the bluff, from which point Davy and a young man named Flavius Harris went back to his cabin in the skiff, given to them by the boatman. They at once cleared a field, in the usual rough way, leaving the charred stumps standing and planting among them. Davy put in enough corn to do for the winter, but had no time for fencing. It was late spring, and he was anxious to return for his family. While thus planting and planning, Davy killed 10 bears and a great abundance of deer, repaying the Owens family many times over for their kindness to him and his boy. In these weeks of hard work, the only white faces seen were those of the Owenses, and once in a while those of men looking over the country. There were many Indians in the timber, and sometimes they came to Davy's clearing, and watched with vague forebodings the gleam of the axe and the tender green of the springing grain. Their traditions were full of the untrammeled freedom of the wilderness, of the plentiful supplies of game and mast, of rivers alive with fish, on whose banks the beaver and otter were scarcely afraid of those who wore the splendid peltries of their kind. When they turned from the scene towards the solitude of the wilderness, their hearts were sad, for the knell of their race resounded through their ancient temples, built by the Great Spirit, whose aisles were rows of stately oak and pine, whose arches of living green were hung with golden blossoms of the tulip tree and the fiery clusters of the trumpet vine. There was no sentiment in the heart of the pioneer, who classed the Indian, the wolf, and the moccasin of the steaming swamp as equally worthy of extermination. When the corn had started, Davy made his way back to Shoal Creek, and from there to Nashville to attend a special session of the legislature. With his $3 per diem in his pocket, he returned to the scene of his disasters, and as soon as possible started with all his family for the clearing on the Rutherford Fork of the Obion, where Harris was working out his own salvation with axe and fire, while keeping the varmints out of the Crockett corn. It was sometime in the fall of 1822 that the wearied family came in sight of the rude cabin that was to be their home. Most of them had tramped the 150 miles across the trackless land, for upon the horses were loaded the household effects and wearing apparel that Davy still owned. The loom, the wooden trencher, spare clothing, table utensils, and a few rude dishes were about all the pioneers thought necessary in these days, always excepting the priceless ammunition and the guns. The small clearing of 6 to 8 acres that Davy had made, a quarter of a mile east of the fork, could only partly feed so many mouths, and the task of supporting his family would have been desperate had it not been for the supply of game that could always be counted upon. The river and the lakes were full of fish, and when the meat for the winter had been cured or salted down, there was always a good chance of getting more if needed. When Davy had harvested his crop of corn in the last of October, 1822, he set out for the usual fall hunt. The buffalo had already disappeared from that vicinity, and he never saw one of those ponderous animals until he was on his way to the Alamo in the last year of his life. Of all the other wild varmints, as he termed them, the woods were full. When Christmas approached, Davy's supply of powder ran low, and he determined to cross the fork and to go to the home of a brother-in-law who had settled 6 miles west, and who had brought with him a keg of powder for Davy. The river was full of slush, ice, and was out of its banks as when Davy first saw it, but the determination to have powder for the usual Christmas fusillade, and the fact that they were out of meat, overruled his wife's argument that they might as well starve as to have him drown or freeze. With his gun and hunting tools, and a few extras in the way of clothing, he started through the deep snow that had fallen, and waded across 1/2 mile of flooded ground, until the main channel was before him. This he crossed on a log that lay from bank to bank, but farther on he came to a slough which was wider than the river itself, though he had always been able to cross it on another log. This was entirely under water, but he recognized its location by the sapling that stood beside it. By cutting another long sapling and lodging it against the first, he managed to use the submerged log as a bridge, and reached an island now under water in the slough. Again, wading for a long distance, he crossed another slough part way on a floating log, but fell off it when it turned over with him. He waded out of the water, which was nearly up to his head, and when he got to solid ground, put on the dry clothing which he had held with his rifle above the water. He says that after he had done this and had hung the wet clothing on the bushes, he had no feeling in his flesh. He tried to run to warm himself, but could scarcely move his feet. When he got to his brother-in-law's cabin, he thought the smell of fire the best thing he had ever known. The next morning was piercing cold, and he stayed there to hunt, killing 2 deer for the family. The 3rd day he decided to return, hoping that the ice had frozen so as to help him cross the still places in the sloughs. But time after time he broke through, and when he reached the sloughs and the river he had to go through the same performance as he had when he first crossed them. A feat made even harder by having to cross first with his gun and then go back for the powder keg. The ice had been broken as if a bear had gone across, and he at once fresh primed his gun so that he was ready to make war upon him if he appeared. When Davy reached his home, he was hailed as one risen from the dead. He learned that the ice had been broken by a man sent after him by his distressed wife, who had given up hope of his ever returning. He concludes this incident by saying, "I wasn't quite dead, but mighty nigh it. But I had my powder, and that was what I went for." This impatience at delay was one of Davy's traits. He might easily have managed to subsist until the falling of the water, or until the ice was strong enough to bear him, but he couldn't wait. It is a sure thing that he celebrated Christmas with a part of the dearly earned powder. End of chapter 9.
The Election. Hunting in the hurricane. His dream of a big black nigger. His dogs bark up the wrong tree. A bear as big as a bull. Davy's trip to Jackson. Meets some former comrades in arms. his name again suggested for the legislature. He becomes a candidate in hunting coat and coonskin cap. He's elected a member from his new district. Votes against Jackson's friend for United States Senator. Old Hickory puts a mark opposite Crockett's name. In the next election, Davy is defeated by Jackson's influence. Returns to farming again. Davy Crockett in his time was celebrated as the greatest bear hunter that ever lived. The story of one of his hunts was probably read by almost every man, woman, and child of his generation in Tennessee. His own version is by far the best, and is now given word for word as he wrote it. First, let the reader understand that Davy's cabin was near the Rutherford Fork of the Obion on the east side, and just below the Hurricane, where either a great windstorm or a not uncommon earthquake had laid most of the timber flat. East of the cabin, 5 or 6 miles, was the middle or main fork of the Obion. A look at the map will show very nearly the location of his home. The hunt began the morning after he had secured his precious keg of powder. Davy's story is as follows. That night there fell a heavy rain, and it turned to sleet. In the morning all hands turned out hunting. My young man and a brother-in-law, who had lately settled near me, went down the river to hunt for turkeys, but I was for larger game. I told them I had dreamed the night before of having had a hard fight with a big black nigger, and I knowed it was a sign I was to have a battle with a bear, for in a bear country I never knowed such a dream to fail. So I started to go above the Hurricane, determined to have a bear. I had 2 pretty good dogs and an old hound, which I took along. I had got about 6 miles up the river, and it was then about 4 miles across to the main Obion. So I determined to strike across to that, as I had found nothing yet to kill. I got out to the river and turned down it, but the sleet was still getting worse and worse. The bushes were all bent down and locked together, so it was almost impossible to get along. In a little time my dogs started a large gang of old turkey gobblers, and I killed 2 of the biggest sort. I shouldered them up and moved on until I got through the Hurricane again, when I was so tired that I laid my gobblers down to rest, as they were confounded heavy, and I was mighty tired. While I was resting, my old hound went to a log and smelt it a while, and then raised his eyes towards the sky and cried out. Away he went, and my other dogs with him, and I shouldered up my turkeys again and followed on as hard as I could drive. The dogs were soon out of sight, and in a very little time I heard them begin to bark. When I got to them, they were barking up a tree, but there was no game there. I concluded that it had been a turkey, and that it had flew away. When they saw me coming, away they went again, and after a little time began to bark as before. When I got near them, I found they were barking up the wrong tree again, as there was no game there. They served in this way 3 or 4 times, until I was so infernal mad that I determined, if I could get near enough, to shoot the old hound at least. With this intention I pushed on the harder, till I came to the edge of an open prairie, and looking on before my dogs, I saw in and about the biggest bear that ever was seen in America. He looked at the distance he was from me like a big black bull. My dogs were afraid to attack him, and that was the reason why they had stopped so often, that I might overtake them. They were now almost up with him, and I took my gobblers from my back and hung them up in a sapling, and broke like a quarter horse after my bear, for the sight of him had put new springs in me. I soon got near to him, but they were just getting into a roaring thicket, and so I couldn't run through it, but had to pick my way along, and had close work at that. In a little while I saw the bear climbing up a big black oak tree, and I crawled on till I got within about 80 yards of him. He was setting with his breast to me, and so I put fresh priming in my gun and fired at him. At this he raised one of his paws and snorted loudly. I loaded again as quick as I could and fired as near the same place in his breast as possible. At the crack of my gun, here he came tumbling down, and the moment he touched the ground, I heard one of my best dogs cry out. I took my tomahawk in one hand and my big butcher knife in the other, and ran up within 4 or 5 paces of him, at which he let my dog go, and fixed his eyes on me. I got back in all sorts of a hurry, for I knowed that if he got hold of me, he would hug me altogether too close for comfort. I went to my gun and hastily loaded her again, and shot him a third time, which killed him for good. I now began to think about getting him home, but I didn't know how far it was, so I left him and started. And in order to find him again, I would blaze a sapling every little distance, which would show me the way back. I continued this until I got within a mile of home, for there I knowed very well where I was, and that I could easily find my way back to my blazes. When I got home, I took my brother-in-law and my young man and 4 horses and went back. We got there just before dark, and struck up a fire and commenced butchering my bear. It was some time in the night before we finished it, and I can assert, on my honor, that I believe he would have weighed 600 pounds. It was the second largest I ever saw. I killed one a few years afterwards that weighed 617 pounds. I now felt fully compensated for my sufferings in going after my powder, and well satisfied that a dog may be doing a good business even when he seems to be barking up the wrong tree. The bear referred to as weighing 600 pounds was a fine specimen of a black bear of the East, but the white bears of Alaska are nearly twice as large. In 1909, near the western extremity of the Alaskan Peninsula, a white bear was killed by Dr. J. Wiley Anderson of Denver, and Mr. Hornaday, the celebrated zoologist, estimated its weight at 1,200 pounds. In the month of February 1823, Davy went to Jackson carrying a great quantity of skins to sell. Jackson was then a little crossroads settlement, the county seat of Madison County, and about 40 miles from Davy's clearing. He was there about 24 hours before the skins were sold, and supplies of sugar, coffee, salt, powder, and lead were bought and packed in readiness for an early start for home the next day. About this time, the outlaws and cutthroats that afterwards came under the leadership of John A. Morrell were haunting the highways of the southwestern part of Tennessee. Now and then stories of murders by Indians were heard with suspicion by the wise. There were white murderers as well as red ones, they thought. Even Davy had little desire to stay any longer than necessary in that vicinity, for the fact that he was now worth robbing might become known to the outlaws, who watched for victims with the keen vision and cruelty of wolves that howled at night in the dark shadows of the pines. But the evening was before him, and a man who had worked and hunted for 6 months, as he had, might be expected to look for recreation. He wanted to hunt up some of the men whom he had known in the Creek War, and before long he found enough of them to make a quorum in the barroom, whose tallow candles threw a dull glow across the muddy street. If Davy had gone to bed after getting ready to start, his future would have been different, and his history might never have been of special interest to the world. While Davy and his fellow soldiers were busy talking over old times, others came in, among them 3 prominent candidates for nomination for the legislature in that district, which included 11 counties. One of these was Dr. Butler, nephew by marriage to General Jackson. Someone said to Davy, "Crockett, here are 3 candidates for the legislature. You ought to offer also, seeing that you know the ropes so well." Davy was in no doubt as to the man's sincerity, but he may have had this thought in mind himself. He seems to have had no idea of trying to run, for he told the man that he lived 40 miles from a settlement, and had no intention of electioneering. He went home the next morning with his little boy, and took up his usual round of duties. About a week afterwards a stranger appeared at the edge of the little clearing of 6 or 7 acres, in the midst of which the smoke curled peacefully from the great mud and sticks chimney of the Crockett home. He came to the door, which almost always stood open, even in the coldest weather, this being the usual custom in that part of the country, and when he was seated before the leaping flames of the fireplace, he took a paper from his pocket and read aloud the announcement of Davy's offering for the nomination. Davy heard it with the same suspicion as that with which he had heard the suggestion of Jackson. But the fact that the announcement would look genuine to the public put him on his mettle. It was time to begin the spring work on his little wilderness farm. But for this he hired a young man, and at once set out to feel the public pulse. Everywhere he went, his fame as a bear hunter and as the member from the Canebrakes had gone before him. The 3 men whom he had met at Jackson had settled their affairs by caucus. Dr. Butler had been named, and the others were working for him. To these men Davy's electioneering was a huge joke. He lived a 3 days' tramp through the wilderness from any public highway. He was a poor man, still a rough backwoodsman, and appeared as little to be feared by his opponents as did Andrew Jackson at first in the eyes of the silk stockings of the Old Dominion, who had so nearly monopolized the statesmanship of the nation. As the campaign went on, the news that Davy Crockett would be at a meeting brought out of the woods men who had been there so long that they were like the Butler County men who had to be blindfolded to get him on the cars. Whether it was a barbecue, a shooting match, corn husking, log rolling, or any other of the usual out-of-doors gatherings, Davy, dressed in homespun and wearing a coonskin cap, and always with his rifle in hand, was the object of attention and admiration. When he met his opponents, he told them that he had little money to use in electioneering. Plenty of tobacco twist and a jug of liquor would be his best weapons. His young man and the coon dogs on the fork would tree and capture all the coons needed to furnish funds for the supplies. But in a pinch he could go a-wolfing, kill a wolf, and get $3 of the state treasury money for the scalp to keep him along on the big string. His way of talking was more suited to the frontier than to the halls of state. But the voters were with him on election day, and with 3 candidates against him, Davy came out with 247 more votes than all the others together. The news of his election to the legislature in a district to which he had just removed, after serving as a representative from another part of the state, made him famous within the boundaries of Tennessee and even beyond. When the first session of the legislature took place, it chose a new United States Senator to succeed John Williams, whose term was about to close. Senator Williams was up for re-election, and it was evident that the opposition could not beat him with their candidate. In this emergency, they appealed to Andrew Jackson to allow his name to be used against Williams. At that time, Jackson was the most talked of candidate for the presidency of the United States. But he was not unwilling to become a member of the Senate while biding his time, and he entered into the contest at Nashville, receiving 10 more votes in the joint session of the legislature than Colonel Williams. Davy Crockett was one of the 25 who voted against Andrew Jackson. Referring to this matter, Davy said in later years, "Voting against the old chief was mighty uphill business to all of them except myself. I never would, nor never did, acknowledge that I was wrong. And I am more certain now that I voted right than ever. I told the people it was the best vote I ever gave, that I had supported the public interest and cleared my conscience in giving it, instead of gratifying the private ambition of a man. I let the people know as early as then that I wouldn't take a collar round my neck. Thus early in his career as a statesman, Davy became the political enemy of Jackson. It is not likely that he ever forgave the general for his attempt to force his volunteers to stay longer than they had enlisted for. Jackson was for a tariff, and Davy's party locally were against it. He was looking towards the fulfillment of their wishes, and had no way to avoid a vote against Old Hickory, who without doubt put a mark opposite the name of Crockett, for the purpose of remembering him and punishing him when a chance came about. Davy Crockett is said to have been the first prominent Whig in Tennessee. His prominence began with his second election as a state representative, and while still in that capacity, he was talked of as a possible congressman. In 1824, the first tariff law was passed by the Congress of the United States, and Tennessee was not in favor of it. Davy was at last persuaded to run for Congress, and made an uphill fight for the prize. Cotton rose in price after the tariff law was passed, and the planters and merchants were so elated with their sudden prosperity that they gave Colonel Alexander, Davy's opponent, credit for having helped them by his actions as a congressman. He was elected by 2 votes only over Davy, who never felt entirely satisfied that the count was fair. There was nothing to do but to go back to work again as a farmer, with an eye to any speculation that he might be able to undertake. Some of his adventures during the year 1825 will be told in the next chapter. End of chapter 10.